It's my blessed and wonderful privilege to have my great friend, Dr. Charles Edward Booth, here with us for this interview on preaching. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate not only the fact that you're here, but the years and years of relationship and what you've meant to my life, my ministry, my family's life. So thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Let me say at the outset that I appreciate again how meaningful your visit was to me back in 2015 before I had my transplant. And I delight in calling you the oil man.
Now, see, now you got to tell everybody. Go ahead and tell them, go ahead and tell them about it.
There's an interesting story behind that. On the Sunday before I went in for my transplant for multiple myeloma, Dr. Thomas and his wife came to visit with us and worship on that particular Sunday. And he anointed me with oil. And he didn't just put a mere spot on my head, but he anointed literally my whole head and face. And I went around for the rest of that day with all of that oil, man, with all of that oil, rather. And to this day, I still call him the oil man.
Well, thank you for that,
Yeah,
man.
thank you.
You mean the world to me. You call me. I couldn't do anything but come. You just mean the world to me.
Well, that meant and still means more to me than you know.
All right, thank you, sir. So for the 3 or 4 or 5 people that don't know who Dr. Charles Edward Booth is, what would you tell them about yourself?
There are multitudes who don't know who I am. But I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and went to Howard University, Eastern Seminary, which is now Palmer. And I did my Doctor of Ministry degree under Dr. Samuel Witt Proctor at United Theological Seminary. Wonderful experience. My first congregation was in Westchester, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, where I was for 7 years. And I have been at Mount Olivet Baptist in Columbus, Ohio now for the last 40 years. In fact, in this coming January will be my 41st year as pastor. I've also served on the faculty at United and also at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. And I've enjoyed a wonderful ministry of not only pastoring and teaching, but doing revivals and that kind of thing. So that's a little bit of who I am.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about your call to ministry. Tell me about your call.
I love to talk about my call because actually I remember heeding the call to ministry when I was 14 years old. And I went to my mother and told her that I had been called to the ministry. And what an interesting response. She smacked me. And I looked at her quite puzzled because this to me was a very serious thing, and to her it was too. And I said, "Why did you smack me?" She said, "Don't play with God. And this is too serious an undertaking for you to do that." I was 14 years old. I waited another 3 years until I was a senior in high school. And then I announced again to my mother that I was called to preach, but this time I backed away. And at that juncture, she said, "Go speak to your pastor and have a conversation with him." And we proceeded from that. I was a senior in high school at that particular time, and I preached my initial sermon. We called it a trial sermon back then. On October the 16th, 1964, on a Friday night in the Enon Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, in the prayer meeting. And I've never forgotten that. That's been over 54 years ago.
Wow.
54 years ago. And the interesting thing I think about my call is that there has never been a time in my conscious recollection that I've not wanted to be a preacher. I've always wanted to be a preacher. There's something in me that has always gravitated towards ministry, and I've always been fascinated by preaching, and particularly black preachers. So that's something that's been in me for ad infinitum.
So where did that come from? Is anybody in your family, your dad, anybody, where does this come from?
Interestingly enough, my great-grandfather, whose name was John William Booth, he was a rural preacher in Gloucester County, Virginia. We were born 100 years apart. He was born in 1847, I was born in 1947. And he pastored 2 churches in Gloucester. One in a place called Sassafras, and a second in Ware Neck, Virginia, where my mother was born. And that was the Union Zion Baptist Church. I was able to get a biography of him. He was not an educated man. He went through high school, but he pastored those two churches in that area. And the church in Sassafras was Bethel, and it was known at that time as Big Bethel. That was his every Sunday church. Union Zion in Ware Neck was his second and fourth Sunday church, and he had a reputation of being quite a preacher. There's a story about him that I've heard, whether true or apocryphal, I don't know, but it is said that many, many years ago, during the Hampton Ministers Conference, that there was a preacher who was to come on a particular day who did not show. And someone said, well, there's a preacher around here who can ring the bell. And they asked my great-grandfather to preach on that particular afternoon, and I understand, quoted the quote, that he rang the bell. So I don't know whether that story is true or not, but early in my ministry, I had the opportunity to preach at Big Bethel in Gloucester, also at Union Zion, my mother's church, where he pastored. And there was an old man who had to have been, well in his 90s at the time, and I could not have been any more than 19 or 20 years old. And when word was out that I was coming to preach, he had his family to bring him to church that Sunday because he wanted to hear the great-grandson of John William Booth. Now, what's interesting about that day, as I recall it, is that this man was introduced to me following the service. He was in a wheelchair, and he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "You're obviously very intelligent, but you cannot moan like him." I'll never forget that, but you cannot moan like him. And my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, used to hear him preach, and he would always refer to him as Old Man Booth. And the great word was that he was quite a country preacher. Wow. I wish I had known him. In my study hangs a picture of him today. Yeah, and there's not a Sunday morning that I go to the pulpit that I don't gaze upon his countenance.
So then tell me how that call flows through the generations to you. How do you articulate that?
I think when I reflect upon my early life, every summer we would go down to Gloucester for homecoming in the month of August. That was always the third weekend in August. And my mother, my sister, and I would always go. And my mother's oldest brother, my Uncle Clarence, would always drive. And they would always have a big service on that third Sunday. They would have a morning service, but the big service was in the afternoon. And it was a delight to always go down at that time, not just to meet relatives, but to hear stories about that church, about my great-grandfather, and about the various preachers who came out of that region. For example, Marcus Garvey Wood, who was a classmate of Martin Luther King Jr. at Crozer, came out of that community. In fact, my mother was present on the night in Union Zion years ago when Marcus Garvey Wood preached his initial sermon. And it was always a tremendous moment for me to sit around and hear people like him talk. My Uncle Banks, who was the husband of my mother's oldest sister, would always save for me Sunday school books from the National Baptist Convention. And those Sunday school books helped form my first library. And for those early years, I would go down and my uncle would always give me those books. But there was always that fascination for me with preaching. I came out of the Enon Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, and my pastor was a graduate of Virginia Union University. And he came out of Virginia Union University years before, when it was Wayland Academy. Wow. And he would always bring preachers from Virginia Union, notably of which was Samuel DeWitt Proctor.
Wow. Wow.
As a boy,
wow.
I listened to him. And that fascination with African American preaching just settled in me as a youngster. I remember one Sunday sitting in church, and Dr. James Kirkland came to preach. And he was pastor of Union Baptist in South Philadelphia, the church out of which Marian Anderson came.
Oh, wow, okay.
And he stood after his preliminaries to read his text. And I remember leaning over to my mother, and I could not have been more than 10 or 11 years of age. And I said, "Mama, what strange language is he talking?" And he was reading his text from the original Greek.
Wow.
And I had never heard anything like that before in my life. So Dr. Payne, my pastor, would always bring those kinds of preachers to our pulpit. Leon Sullivan, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in those early years. I did not hear him then. I heard him years later when I was in college. But there's just always been that fascination.
So tell me about, and with this kind of history, it must have impressed upon you, some formal training for ministry. So how did that happen?
I mentioned my pastor, Dr. Arthur Jerome Payne, who was a native Baltimorean. He grew up in the Waverly section of Baltimore and was a college graduate. And an interesting thing happened. He decided one summer that he would go to New York, particularly to Columbia University, to work on a master's degree. And he went to New York and was going to stay for a summer, 3 months, and ended up staying 3 years working under the mentoring of Adam Clayton Powell Sr. And that was an imprint and impact that lasted upon him for years. Our church at that time, when my mother joined it, was a little church on Park Avenue in Baltimore. And the church began to grow, and they bought the structure they now occupy at Edmondson Avenue and Schroeder Street in Baltimore. And it was an old neo-Gothic structure that was occupied by white people, Brantley Avenue Baptists. Because of gentrification, they were moving out. So my pastor and the Enon Church bought the building. What's interesting, and this is in the early 1950s, on the Sunday that they marched into the church, they burned the mortgage. And Adam Clayton Powell Sr. preached the installation, dedication, mortgage burning sermon. I say all of that to say that Dr. Payne was a stickler for education. That when I announced my call to preach as a senior, there was no question in my mind that once I graduated from high school, I was going to college, and from college on to seminary. I listened to him as a youth, and he was a very articulate man. He was not a big or tall man in stature, but he was a well-respected clergyman in our community. In fact, he was known among many as the dean of, back then, colored Republicans, Negro Republicans. And it was nothing for the governor of Maryland, who at that time was a gentleman by the name of Theodore R. McKeldin, white man, who would come to worship in our church on any given Sunday, not just during a political season, but he would come on a Sunday morning and sit on the front row with all of those people who represented his entourage And Dr. Payne would call on him to give remarks. And I can clearly remember this. He would simply stand and say, I did not come here today for political purposes. I came here today to hear my friend Arthur Payne preach the gospel. Now, here's another interesting story about him. In 1948, he gave one of the seconding speeches for Thomas Dewey, who ran against Harry S. Truman for the Republican nomination of president. 1948. Wow. So that's the kind of church that I came out of. The president of Morgan College at that time, Martin Jenkins, was a member of our church. Nick Aaron Ford, who was the chair of the English department at Morgan and chairman of our Board of Christian Education, was a member of our church. Archie Williams, a noted attorney, was a member of our church. Maurice Doles, a dentist, was a member of our church. I looked at these people every Sunday. My pastor's wife, Odell Watkins Payne, was one of the chief counselors at Douglas High School in Baltimore, which is the school that Thurgood Marshall graduated from. So all of those tributaries were flowing into me at a young age. And with the kinds of preachers that he would bring to our pulpit were always persons of tremendous inspiration and encouragement to me. So there was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to school. And he did not have to push me to do it. Yeah. Not at all.
So tell me about seminary for you.
Seminary was a very interesting experience for me. When I graduated from Howard in 1969, I wanted to go to Crozer Seminary. That was the only seminary that I applied to. I visited Colgate Rochester, but I wanted to go to Crozer. And I wanted to go to Crozer Seminary for two reasons. Number one, Martin Luther King Jr. went to Crozer Seminary. Number two, Harold Carter Sr., who was the pastor of New Shiloh Baptist in Baltimore, who was my mentor, under whom I worked as an apprentice during my college years, was a graduate of Crozer, and he was also an assistant to Dr. King when Dr. King was at Dexter Avenue. When Dr. King was at Dexter Avenue, Dr. Carter was an undergraduate at Alabama State College. Okay, wow. So those two influences were heavily upon me. And I went to Crozer in the fall of 1969, not knowing that that would be the final year of Crozer's existence in Chester, Pennsylvania. The endowment was running low, the money was running out, and an agreement had been forged between Crozer and Colgate Rochester. So Crozer moved from Chester, Pennsylvania to Rochester, New York. Now, I was placed in a very odd position at that time because in the spring of 1970, when the merger was announced, I had a decision to make. Would I follow the merger from Chester to Rochester, New York? Or would I accept my first church in Westchester? Or would I go back to Howard and do my theological work at the Divinity School? I elected to go to Eastern Seminary in Philadelphia and accept the pastorate of the St. Paul Church in Westchester. Wow. J. Pius Barber and Harold A. Carter twisted my arm. I didn't want to take the church, primarily because I felt that my seminary years ought to be study years, and I didn't want the headache of pastoring and going to school at the same time. And J. Pius Barber and Harold A. Carter coerced me to do it. Amos Brown was leaving the church at that time and going to Pilgrim Baptist Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. So he's the one who recommended me. And I'll never forget that I had a conversation one evening in the hallway of Old Main, which was the dormitory classroom building on the campus of Crozer. And I was talking with Dr. Harold Carter. And I said, I'm in a dilemma because I really don't want to take this church. And I just want to enjoy my years as a student. And he said these words to me, and the years have not erased them. He said, it would be a tragedy for God to open a door for you and then for you to slam it in his face. Have a good evening. Click. And that was our conversation. But that 1 year at Crozer Theological Seminary, from the fall of '69 through the spring of '70, was not only a wonderful year for me in terms of theological study, getting my feet wet in terms of studying theologically, but that's when I got to know J. Pius Barber. And all of those African-American preachers who had come through Crozer, Martin King, Harold Carter, Bill Jones, Sam Proctor, all of them had come through the parlor of J. Pius Barber. And he was one of the most thoughtful, intelligent, theological people I've ever met in my life. He was the first African American to get a Master of Theology degree from Crozer Seminary. And I was with him on the night before he died in Lankenau Hospital. But my seminary years were very wonderful years because I had the benefit of going to Crozer for a year, which was, of course, a very liberal theological institution, compared to Eastern, which was a very conservative theological institution. So I got a good balance between the two, and it, for me, was very profitable.
I want to go back to the J. Pius Barber. Of course, in our relationship, you've always talked about that, but just for somebody who may not be familiar, so talk about what that meant, what it was, and how and why so many of these great preachers of our tradition went through J. Pius Barber.
If you went to Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and you were African American, you went through J. Pius Barber. And most biographers who write about Dr. King will include J. Pius Barber. Richard Leisher, for example, the homiletician at Duke, in his book, The Preacher King, gives a whole lot of credit to Dr. Barber. Dr. Barber pastored the Calvary Baptist Church, 1614 West 2nd Street in Chester, Pennsylvania. And I remember his telephone number, area code 215 Tremont 46717. I would call him every night. He was brilliant, very gruff. He was a Morehouse man. And he was the kind of man who would help you with your preaching. For example, when you would preach for him at Calvary, he would sit and he would take a piece of paper and grade you. He would grade you on your introduction, and this was one of his favorite words. He would grade you on his content, and then he would grade you on what he would call, what you call celebration. Right. He called climax. And he would sit down with you following the sermon back in his study and critique your sermon. And he would have no problem critiquing your sermon. And there was not a black preacher who ever came through Crozer who did not pass through the mentoring of J. Pius Barber. There's a book out now, I told you about it, on the seminary years of Dr. King called The Seminarian, and the author escapes me now, but I just finished reading the book. But he spends a whole lot of time talking about the impact of J. Pius Barber on Martin Luther King Jr. I remember once having a conversation with Dr. Barber, and he said that when Dr. King had come to prominence, he happened to come through Chester. In fact, when Dr. King came back from Oslo, having received the Nobel Peace Prize, on his way back to Atlanta, he and Mrs. King stopped in Chester. Now, I don't remember as to whether or not this was the occasion of this particular story, but there was an occasion when Dr. King had come to prominence, when he stood in Dr. Barber's office, and there was a full-length mirror. And Dr. Barber said that Dr. King stood and looked in that mirror and asked the question, who am I? That it was never my desire to ever be a civil rights leader. He always wanted to be a preacher in the tradition of Benjamin Elijah Mays and Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, and that somehow or another, under the aegis of God, he ended up the Martin Luther King Jr. that history knows, but that was never his intent. And he always kept in touch with Dr. Barber. And there was never a major decision that Martin King ever made that he did not call and talk to Dr. Barber about. Not one.
Tell me about the Sunday night gathering that over at his house.
I chuckle because on Sunday night, Dr. Harold Carter's broadcast from Baltimore, Maryland would come on at 9:05 at night. And WBAL radio, which was a powerful station coming out of Baltimore, after 9 o'clock, that radio beam shot up the East Coast. All the way, it would go south as far as Richmond, and it would go north as far as Nova Scotia. And on Sunday night, if you were near radio, you turn on 1100 WBAL AM, and you'd catch Harold Carter preaching. And he just had a melodious voice. He sounded like Dr. King. And on Sunday nights, there were occasions when I would drive from Westchester to Chester, and we would sit and listen to Dr. Carter preach. One particular Sunday night, I drove from Westchester to Chester, and we listened to Dr. Carter preach. So after the sermon, Dr. Barber, who had a very gruff voice, called Carter. I want to talk to him. So I dialed Dr. Carter's number, and I said, Doc, I'm here with Dr. Barber, and he wants to talk with you. So I handed the phone to Dr. Barber, and Dr. Barber said, Carter, we just listened to your sermon, and Booth said it was absolutely nothing. I hollered, I said, Dr. Carter, I did not say that. I sounded like a little kindergarten student. And he just got the biggest kick out of that and hung up the phone. So when I got back to Westchester, I called I said, Dr. Carter, listen, I did not say that. He said, I know you didn't say that. I know Dr. Barber was having fun. But that was the kind of person that he was. Yeah. That was the kind of person he was.
So let's talk about your preaching. So when you reflect on the fabulous preaching that you do, you consider yourself a narrative preacher, an expository preacher, or what? So how would you define your preaching?
If I had to define my preaching, I would define it this way. I am a narrative preacher who uses the dialectic.
Now you got to tell everybody about the dialectic.
All right. The dialectic comes from the Hegelian understanding of how all of history, from Hegel's standpoint, dealt with the whole notion of a thesis, that there was a positive side of history, an antithesis, that which mitigates against that which is positive. Out of that tension, one develops a synthesis. So there's the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis. Now, when we studied the dialectic under Dr. Proctor, he included two things in the dialectic for homiletics. One, he said, there must be a proposition. Mm-hmm. And the proposition is one succinct, declarative sentence that defines what the sermon is all about. Yes. If you can't say what the sermon is in one sentence, then you really don't have a real handle on what you're talking about. He said, because there's the tension between the thesis and the antithesis, out of that tension, before you get to the synthesis, you must raise what he calls the relevant question. So that the synthesis is not just the resolution of the tension between the thesis and the antithesis, but it is the question with which the synthesis wrestles and answers. So for me, I would consider myself one who loves narrative preaching. I love to preach stories, and I do it in the dialectical context. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your sermon preparation process.
I love prep because what I like to do, and I get this from Dr. Barber. Dr. Barber said that on Sunday night, you ought to sit and at least have an idea of where you're going for the next Lord's Day. Mm-hmm. And even if it's a scant thought, jot it down on a piece of paper and let that be kind of a guiding norm for the next couple of days. Yeah. And for the next few days, you begin to expand that thought. One of the things that I've always believed in is that in sermon preparation, you are guided by the text, and out of the text comes the subject. Yeah. That you really don't get a subject and then hunt or search for a text. Right. So if I have a thought in my mind, I want that thought to have an accompanying scripture. Yeah. So with that thought, there ought to be some text in mind. And I kind of look at the text and give some thought to how I want to approach it. The next day or two, do some exegetical work on the text. And about that third day, I want to form an outline. Mm-hmm. And I write out a full outline of the sermon, a full skeleton. Okay. I do that every week. And from that skeleton, I then put meat on the bones. Okay. Because even though I don't use a manuscript, still I write a manuscript. And I write the manuscript because writing the manuscript gives me precision. Mm-hmm. And it helps me to really focus organizationally in what I'm dealing with. Right. I try my best to have my sermon written by Thursday or Friday. Mm-hmm. In my earlier years, I would wait until Saturday, until I discovered that Saturday night specials kill. But I try my best to have it done by Thursday or Friday, and then Saturday I spend time, maybe about an hour, rereading it. And I'll take my manuscript with me into the pulpit and read through it while the worship experience is going on. And then in most instances, I'll put it away. Sometimes I'll put it up there at the beginning if there are certain particulars that I want to be precise about. Yeah. And once I do that, I'll tuck it away. But by and large, I don't use notes when I preach.
So you wouldn't consider yourself a manuscript preacher then?
No, not at all.
Okay, so behind, you're up preaching, there are no notes, but behind this is a written manuscript.
A written manuscript. Behind the sermon is a full skeletal outline
Okay.
and a manuscript.
Okay.
So there are two documents.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not one who's into technology, so I don't type and use the computer and all of that. And after 54 years, I'm still writing sermons longhand.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'm still writing sermons longhand.
So these are archived somewhere, I'm sure.
Yes, I have them in little Scully books.
How many years of Scully books do you have?
Oh my God. That coupled with legal pads, and my God, you're looking at 50 years, at least. If I've been preaching 54 years, you're looking at 54 years worth of work. I just moved, I recently married. And in moving, I discovered old manuscripts from years ago. And it was fascinating to stop at certain points and look at some of those manuscripts and say to yourself, how did the people suffer this? How did they put up with this nonsense? You look back at those early years and you say to yourself, they had to suffer through all of this. And you fall down on your knees and say, God, forgive me. But it's a good growth tool to look back and see what you did and what you are doing. And even now, after 54 years, I still get great joy out of preparing and writing a sermon. And I refuse to relax on my laurels. I know guys who go back and preach sermons from 15, 20 years ago, and there are some sermons that you could perhaps go back and resurrect. Yeah. But at the same time, I believe in freshness. And if you're still pastoring of people who are listening to you every week, they deserve, I think, the best of your study, the best of your preparation. And I seek to do that.
Tell me about the most difficult preaching moment for you that you had to rise, and it was the toughest and the most difficult sermon you had to preach.
I can quickly recall two moments. One, I remember back in 1981, when I preached at the Baptist World Alliance Youth Conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that was the first time I think I had ever preached with an interpreter. And that created all kinds of anxiety in me. But perhaps my greatest moment of tension was preaching in the Hampton Ministers Conference. And I don't have to tell you about that. And I've been privileged to preach in that conference on 3 different occasions. And all 3 occasions created in me great anxiety. It's a wonderful thing to get the invitation, but it's another thing to stand before that august body and preach. There has been no anxiety or tension in me that rivals that which I have felt at Hampton.
Tell me about it.
I shudder even now when I think about it.
That's right. Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Man, when you get the letter inviting you to be the preacher, and I've been the morning preacher, I've been the evening preacher, and I've been a lecturer. Mm-hmm. When the letter comes, you are excited and enthusiastic because quote, end of quote, only the creme de la creme get to Hampton.
Right, that's right.
And you say to yourself, wow, I've been invited to Hampton. But the closer you get, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
You're not telling me anything I don't know.
The closer you get to that June date, your palms get sweaty, you can't sleep, You wonder if you have the right sermon.
Yeah.
And you're just downright scared. And I don't think I have ever in my life had that kind of tension.
We have international viewers, so set the context of what Hampton is.
Hampton, the Hampton Ministers Conference is a conference in which the best so-called preaching, and particularly black preaching, is exposed. So that when you go to the Hampton stage, you go with your A game. Not B, C, or D, but your A game. And preachers come literally from all over the country and from different parts of the world to attend that conference. And it's a non-denominational conference. Baptist preachers, Methodist preachers, apostolic preachers, Pentecostal preachers. That conference is designed to bring the best preachers in the world to that gathering. And people come expecting to hear something that's far beyond what is the norm. And that's a tall order.
It sure is.
That's a tall order.
Yes.
And you know, when I think now, if I were to be given another chance at it, I wouldn't take it. No, I'm done with that.
Yeah.
I'm done with that. I'm done with that. Another tense moment for me, there were two more. The first time I was invited back to Howard University to preach in Rankin Chapel on a Sunday morning was a very tense time for me. Dr. Evans Crawford was the dean at the time. And during my undergraduate years, I would go to Rankin Chapel, and that's where I heard William Holmes Borders, Benjamin Elijah Mays, Howard Thurman, and to be invited back to your alma mater and to stand where those greats stood was a very tense moment. I remember another time going to Brooklyn to preach for Johnny Ray Youngblood. And we came into the pulpit that night, and who walks in but Gardner Calvin Taylor? And
I'm laughing for the audience because he told me this story, so I know where he's going. Go ahead.
Oh my God. I'm sitting there and I leaned over and I said, "Is that who I think it is?" "Yes, it is." And I had to get up and go to the bathroom. And he sat there and he would not look at you directly, but he would turn his head and close his eyes and pitch his ear towards you. He didn't want to see you. He wanted to hear you. I'll never forget that night. That was many, many, many years ago in Brooklyn, New York. And you know, it's like sitting there saying to yourself, God has come to hear me preach tonight. And I've had subsequent moments like that because in his latter years when he moved to North Carolina, I would go to Durham every year in August to preach at White Rock Baptist. And he would come hear me every year. And that feeling never left.
So for our audiences who may be international, who may not know who Gardner Calvin Taylor is.
Gardner Calvin Taylor has been touted as the Dean of African American Preachers. Time magazine has so honored him, and he has been known not just in African American preaching circles, but in the field of homiletics in general, as being one of the greatest voices to ever stand in the Christian pulpit.
Yes.
His preaching, I think, is unparalleled and unmatched. You know, here's a man who comes out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who sounds like somebody who has descended from the English-speaking world. And he's just phenomenal to me.
I want you to give me your favorite out of all the years of going to the Hampton Ministers Conference. What is your favorite Hampton moment?
In hearing preachers? The year that Dr. Gardner C. Taylor gave his sermons. It was in Ogden Hall, and he preached from Ephesians. I remember two of the sermons. One sermon was entitled The Church of the Lord, and another one was entitled The Lord of the Church. I will never forget that. And I cannot remember which one of those sermons, but one night, it was probably that second night, we were up in the balcony. Walter Thomas, James Perkins, Johnny Youngblood, Jerome Ross. We were up in the balcony of Ogden Hall. And Dr. Taylor got to the end in his celebration and stopped and said, "Look!" And everybody in that auditorium looked. And he started talking about the coming of the Lord. Oh my God. It was judgment that night. What's humorous about that, after that, the benediction was given and people were still shouting. We were descending from the balcony down the flight from Ogden Hall, and you went down one flight of stairs, and then there was a landing, then there was a second flight. When Jerome Ross got to the second flight, now the service has been over for 20 minutes, he shouted. He shouted when we got to the bottom landing, going out of the door, and the sermon had been over for 20 minutes. I'll never forget that. To the longest day I live.
We argue about this, so we may as well. So what's your favorite Gardner Calvin Taylor sermon?
Yours is His Own Clothes.
Oh, God.
Yeah, that's your sermon.
It don't get no better than that. It gets no better than His Own Clothes.
My favorite sermon of Gardner C. Taylor is the sermon he preached about Job. Looking at life through a narrow slit. When the window narrows to a slit. He preached it some years ago at Bishop College, in the heyday when Bishop College had a great ministers' conference. That's my favorite Gardner Taylor sermon.
Let's go to the other side. So when is there a time that you felt like that God really used you, that the Spirit of God just used you? When was there a time in your preaching life where you just...
That's not difficult, because I remember the year at Hampton when I did the lectures on hermeneutics. And I preached my closing, gave my closing lecture, which turned into a sermon.
Right, I'm going there next.
Yeah. What's the name of that hall? It's slipping my mind.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, Ogden.
Ogden Hall.
Yes.
And I was up to preach. Carolyn Showell had spoken before me and had literally set that place in chaos. And they adjourned and said, we're going to take about a 20-minute break, and then we'll come back and hear Charles Booth. I just sat on the stage. I never moved. And I got up to give my closing lecture. And I remember lecturing on the parable that Jesus taught. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to one. And the title of that was, When Life Deals You an Uneven Hand.
I love that.
And that for me, was a moment that I'll never forget. It was one of those rare times when I felt the power of God and knew that it was authentic. That was my most memorable moment.
I think that's your signature sermon. We put that in the anthology, Norton Anthology of African American Preaching, Preach It with Sacred Fire, because I think that's your signature. That's your signature sermon. It's a powerful, powerful, powerful.
That was a memorable moment for me. I'll never forget that.
Now, can you explain how it is that you're supposed to lecture in the African American preaching tradition, and then you end up preaching? Because there's some traditions a lecture means a lecture, and
right.
Preaching means preaching. So,
but not so in the African American tradition. There was an old man in Columbus, Ohio, years ago, who pastored the Love Zion Baptist Church. His name was Marvin Myers. And he would always say that whatever you do, preach a little bit. I don't care whether it's a lecture, a luncheon address, whatever the case may be, even in remarks, preach a little bit. And you know that in the African American preaching tradition, you may be slated for a lecture, but at the end of the day, you know that audience or that congregation, to use Harold Carter's phrase, is waiting for you to pull it. You have to yank it a little bit. Otherwise, they will say, he flunked today. But there's just that expectation. There's just that sense of really ending what you're doing with a preaching note. Right. That there's got to be the insertion of that preaching sense before you sit down. Yes. And if you don't do it, you even feel that somehow you've missed the boat. But, when I'm called to lecture, I try to honor the moment. But depending upon what you're talking about and depending upon the flow of what you are saying can determine how the audience responds. And how your audience or your congregation responds determines whether or not you take that sermonic flight or not. That's right. Somebody asked Gardner Taylor one day, his wife said to him, he asked his wife, what's the difference between a sermon and a lecture? And she said, a lecture has more information. Oh, that's what I remember.
Yeah. Talk about the influence of Samuel DeWitt Proctor on your life.
Samuel DeWitt Proctor has, and I speak in the present tense, an impact on my life that will never go away. As a boy, I listened to him when he would preach annually at our church. He was president of Virginia Union. My pastor was a graduate of Virginia Union University. So Dr. Proctor would come and preach every year for us. So as a teenage boy, I remember him, and even before. When I was privileged to do my Doctor of Ministry degree under him at United Seminary, that really gave me an opportunity to get to know him up close and to really see his brilliance. Mm-hmm. He was not only a preacher, but he was a theologian and educator and all of that. And I recall vividly the first week of our intensive at United Seminary.
For our audience, I know, of course, what you're talking about.
I'm sorry.
Just back up a bit.
When we started our Doctor of Ministry program, there was an intensive, and that's when you go to the campus for one whole week and study. And you did that twice a year. You did it in January and you did it in August. Yeah. And then you would also have intermittent sessions.
I'm talking about the Proctor Fellows.
Oh, the Proctor Fellows, I'm sorry.
That's right.
There was a group that came together under the name of the Proctor Fellows to study for the Doctor of Ministry degree. Otis Moss, Jeremiah Wright, Johnny Youngblood, James Perkins, Donald Hilliard, Frank Madison Reed, Mac Charles Jones, who's dead, Charles Hampton, who went on to become a bishop in the CME Church. All of us were together under Dr. Proctor, and it was a pretty strong group. And I remember in our first intensive, around that second evening when we came back from dinner in the old campus, we went downstairs in Bone Break Hall, and we were all around this table, Jeremiah Wright, all of us. And Dr. Proctor gave a lecture entitled, "The Arrows in My Quiver." And what he talked about for about an hour and a half were all of the educational and theological influences on his life, going back to elementary school in Norfolk, Virginia, all the way through his PhD studies at Boston University. And he held us spellbound. Arrows in my quiver. Fascinating. I listened to, on YouTube, a lecture that Jeremiah Wright did on preachers he's heard across the years. Fascinating to me.
That was done here.
Was that done here? Fascinating.
Right there.
It was done. That to me.
70 years of black preaching.
Yeah, that's what it was.
That's what it was.
And that was something of what Dr. Proctor did, where he talked about those kinds of influences and what those people meant. And it was not just educators and preachers, but he talked about people who helped him along the way. People who gave him jobs and people who gave him money to help him with his education. And he held us spellbound for about an hour and a half. Arrows in my quiver. Wow. I'll never forget that. And I would have him preach on several occasions at Mount Olivet. And he honored me and humbled me, flattered me, scared me to death, because when I got ready to graduate with my D-Min, he said, when you graduate, I want you to co-mentor a doctoral group with me. And I did 2 groups with him. And I first declined because I didn't feel worthy to be a co-mentor with Samuel DeWitt Proctor. But the impact of that man, and the genius of the man was that he was so akin to so many subjects. There was nothing that he didn't know. I remember once we came to class for our D-Min work at United, and he had sat next to a man on the airplane who was a professor at Notre Dame. And he started talking about the fascinating discussion that the two of them had about bioethics. And we're sitting there saying, what in the name of God is this about? He just had an understanding of so many things. When you think about somebody who was not theologically educated, but somebody who really had a liberal arts education, he personified it. He personified it.
What would you say after 54 years in preaching about preaching today?
Preaching today raises many questions for me. I'm a little bit disheartened by what I'm hearing from the younger preachers. I think that there is an overemphasis on praise and prosperity. I don't think that there is the kind of time that should be given to exegesis and prayerful study. And when I hear so much of what's being lifted today in our tradition, it greatly discourages me. I guess my greatest critique is that I'm not hearing today what has been for me the genius of the African American pulpit, namely prophetic preaching. There is for me today the absence of the prophetic. And there's no way that you can look at where we are today as a people, when you look at where we are educationally, socially, politically, economically, and not hear the prophetic voice of the African American preacher. And for me, that's very disheartening. And you have some who are holding fast and firm to the tradition, but by and large, you have so many who are not. And for me, another issue for me is that I don't see a lot of concern for people. So many younger preachers now are concerned about what they can get out of the ministry rather than what they can put into it. There's not a lot of caring for the sheep. I don't know that I see a lot of the pastor's heart today in young contemporary preachers. And for me, the absence of the pastoral heart and the prophetic norm raises great questions for me.
I want to thank you. While you're much too modest to admit it, you are one of the donors to the PhD program, you and Mount Olivet. And what you do is allow a student not to have life-altering debt. Mm-hmm. And then when you get to this level of education, often people have debt already and they're shackled. And you were foresightful enough to offer a scholarship for the second cohort. Mm-hmm. So we'll be reviewing applications soon for that. I wanted to thank you for your support. I wanted to thank you for continuing the tradition, investing in it. It's a great source of pride to me that African American churches and pastors stand with us in this effort to keep the tradition alive, teach the tradition, celebrate the tradition, hopefully extend the tradition. So I wanted to just on tape live, and I got tons of ways to go, because I could thank you for our relationship. I can thank you for the night you called me up when I was headed to the Hampton stage, and you said they knew who you were when they invited you. You probably don't remember that. You called me up. I do. You called me up and told me that. Mm-hmm. And that was great comfort, because that pressure is unbelievable.
Right about that.
But I want to thank you for the PhD gift at this moment. And anything that you want to say about the PhD program, why you gave the gift, to encourage the students. They watch these interviews, they share them in their churches. People in seminary, professors use these interviews. I ran into a couple people, a lady from Nigeria who emails me waiting for the next interview. So what would you start with the PhD program, and I'll give you the moment to say whatever you like to say about whatever you like to say, and we'll let that be our concluding.
I would like to say two things. Number one, it must be said that I have enormous respect for you.
Well, thank you for that.
Number one, as a person, a human being. I often say now that seldom do you hear words like decent. We don't use words like integrity, character. And you embody all of these things. I have always greatly respected you as an integritous person. And your love for the African American preaching tradition and your commitment to it is something that I greatly delight in. And when you came to this institution, Christian Theological Seminary, to begin a program in African American preaching and rhetoric, the first of its kind ever, there was no way that I could not be supportive of it. Number one, because you are heading it, and number two, because it's something that represents the first of a kind. And it's but a baby step in terms of what the future possibly holds. And for you to launch out into the deep, as it were, and lay this foundation suggests to me that this program has untold possibilities. And one has to begin somewhere. Why not here? If not you, who? Yeah. If not now, when? Yeah. So when I went to my congregation with the idea, I got no static at all. People know who you are. People respect who you are. And it was an easy sell. So I'm just glad to be aligned with this and want to do beyond what we are contributing, whatever I can do to be of assistance to you in helping this program to flourish.
Whatever you like to say about black preaching, whatever you like to say about whatever you like to say. I mean, this is, you know, sometimes the interviewer will ask the questions that the interviewer, and I want to make sure that you get to say what you would like to say.
You know, a moment ago I talked about the lack of the prophetic in current contemporary African American preaching, and that's where my heart is, going back to the prophetic tradition. You have so many young African American preachers in particular who have never heard the names of people like Henry Highland Garnett or Nathaniel Paul or Francis Grimke. These were great preachers in the 19th century who were raising abolitionist voices, even at the expense of their own lives. And their sermons can be read today. It's not like they're hidden somewhere in antiquity. Right. You can read these people. You know, I know when I was doing my D-Min program, and I can't remember whether it's Nathaniel Paul or Henry Highland Garnett, but one of them said that if I did not believe in the God of liberation, and I'm paraphrasing, then I would tear up my Bible, commit it to flames, and declare it to be nothing more than a book of fables. I'll never forget that. And you know, when you read that stuff and you're looking at, you know, that's 150 years ago. Yeah. And those words are just as relevant today as they were then. And you're talking about men who came not just out of the Baptist tradition, but out of the Presbyterian tradition. You know, everybody knows something about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and all that, but there's so many, you know, the movie Hidden Figures. There's just so many hidden figures in the African American preaching tradition that we need to just resurrect and embody and extend and build upon. And, you know, I want to spend the rest of my life really encouraging that kind of thing. And thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, sir. It's been a wonderful, it has been, so for those of you all watching, we do this off camera, you know, so we talk about preaching and all the time. So I appreciate you, man. I love you deeply, more than there are words for.
And you know the feeling is mutual.
So thank you for doing it, and we're going to get this out. The folks need to see this.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Love you.
Love you too, man.